there was also, along with everyone else in the meeting, there was the senior representative to Robert Kennedy, and he stayed for the whole meeting. And he works directly under RFK, so he was taking furious notes on what RFK can do, what Trump can do to start fixing these things for us urgently. So one thing that some of the detransitioners really hammered home was that we need insurance coverage for detransitioners, and that we need codes, and that we need more people willing to work with us, like Abel was saying, um, because the reversal care for the harm that gender affirming care has caused us is very real. It's very hard to get covered, and a lot of medical professionals won't even touch us. So that is one thing that we were able to really make our point on. But there were quite a few other things brought up, very many important things that I think we're really going to see, Trump start to focus on, RFK start to focus on. Um, the advisor said that Trump is making gender ideology a number one priority in his presidency.
This is Matt Osborne. Last week, I spent 3 days with a group of detransitioners at Detrans Awareness Day 2025 in Washington, D.C. I would like to share some of their voices with you because every one of their stories is different. There is no single story that fits all of them, or even most of them, other than an idea of themselves as being transgender. Some of them are already well known. Others are not public figures. All of them have been harmed to one degree or another, but all of them have been harmed in different ways.
Annika Bigeleisen, welcome to the program.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
It was really great meeting you in Washington, D.C. Can you, for our listeners who don't know you, can you just briefly tell your story?
Yeah, so I'm a desister, meaning I did not medically transition. And I started socially transitioning in my 30s. I'm now in my 40s. And I desisted from my trans identity in when I was 40. And for me, the path towards medical transitioning got blocked when my partner at the time, a trans woman, experienced transition regret. So I was going to take hormones, I was going to get surgeries, I was identifying as a man, and I was actually very excited to go through the medical part of the transition. But my trans woman partner started regretting the medical transition as soon as I started down that path. And so it was actually my partner who talked me out of, or really literally blocked me from getting hormones and getting surgeries. And that's why I am now a desister and not a detransitioner who went through the medical process.
Annika, what did you think about Washington, D.C.?
I really didn't know what to expect. I've never been to an in-person event. And I was really nervous because I felt like I was going to be very different. I know many detransitioners are young, started taking hormones, started transitioning sometimes in their teens or early 20s. So I kind of expected to be the odd one out and not really belong. And I had a really positive experience. It felt really powerful to be around other people who had identified as transgender. It actually felt really supportive to hear the difference in people's stories. I felt nervous about it, thinking, oh gosh, everybody's going to have the same story except me. Mine's going to be so different. I'm not going to belong there. But it felt really great to see how different the reasons are why people transition and how different the reasons are people detransition. It also felt incredible to have an opportunity to speak to lawmakers and to speak to um, reporters and various people who sometimes didn't really know anything about detransitioning. I talked to one reporter who kind of seemed surprised that that was even a thing. She really didn't know much, and it was really interesting to hear, uh, to just see the reactions of people who had no idea that there were so many different detransition stories.
Maia, you really don't need much of an introduction because you've become kind of famous, at least in
Famous or
TC,
infamous?
or infamous, yes. For the benefit of our listeners who don't know your story, however, can you just brief them on your background?
Okay, yeah. So basically, I identified as trans from the age of 12 until the age of 24. Which and the years around this, it would have been, the start of my trans identification was in 2012, and I was really an early adopter of this ideology. What's notable about my story is that my parents are very skeptical, and so they didn't affirm the identity, and it became this kind of back and forth of them preventing me from transitioning and me finding ways to still transition regardless. And once they realized when I entered college that I had begun my social transition, they basically laid down a few red lines in the sand and they said, look, we're paying for your college, so you're not going to medicalize, and you're going to see a therapist of our choice, and you're going to study abroad for a year in a non-Western country that doesn't affirm this stuff. And so I ended up in Israel, and it really wasn't until October 7th when I woke up at 8 in the morning to a siren that I just didn't have the chance to both put on my breast binder, which had allowed me to pass as a man, and to run to the bomb shelter. So I had to choose, I had to prioritize survival over identity. And it was in those moments that I realized multiple things, like, firstly, how impractical it is to spend the rest of your life in transition because some freak accident or a war could happen that you're just totally not expecting, which, of course, interrupts supply chains. And then secondarily, I realized that actually, like, there is a hell on earth worse than gender dysphoria. Whatever discomfort I feel about my body pales in comparison to the discomfort I'm feeling right now as I'm running from rockets and receiving the most horrific images and videos on Facebook live stream. I did realize that actually my body is not a pathology, and that it's in my best interest to, maintain my body in its most healthy and intact state in order to sort of survive whatever life throws at me.
And what did you think about Washington? And you also went to the United Nations, so you can take a minute just to talk about that.
Yeah, so I thought the event was really promising because it's, I mean, when I got into this in 2012, I was certain that I would be like the only quote unquote trans adult that I would know for the rest of my life. Like, that's still how niche it was back then. And to now be on the flip side of this and being so convinced for such a long time and from such a young age that, I would be trans for the rest of my life. And then to have that shattered by some really significant experiences, and now to be, you know, advocating against these ideological and technomedical forces, and this entire crisis that has harmed me specifically and has harmed countless other young people of my generation, and also people who are older than I am. It's, I don't know, it's totally surreal. The event, I think it was really well done. And I also ended up at this like UN sideshow event hosted by CFAM, where I gave a speech about both my life story and some policy objectives that I think ought to be kept in mind. I answered some questions as well. There's a Q&A portion, and there were delegates from all kinds of different places. We had some from different African countries, and we had some from Eastern European countries. We had people from all over the place, and it felt nice to be able to say, look, if your kids speak English and they have social media access, this is very likely the type of stuff they're going to see, even if it hasn't pervaded your culture yet. If your kid speaks English, your kid is at risk. And most kids these days across the world, especially, if they have parents who are attending these types of meetings, almost certainly speak English. And so their kids are at risk. And there are, of course, populations of kids who are more at risk than others. We already know the subtypes, the ones who are autistic, or who might be developing same-sex attraction, or who are just particularly unhappy teenagers. They could stumble upon this material, and if there is enough of a cultural zeitgeist around it, they will latch on regardless of what their parents do. And so it felt meaningful to be able to say, look, I was a really early adopter of this ideology. It hadn't yet pervaded the zeitgeist when I got into it. I wasn't, there wasn't any peer pressure for me to adopt a trans identity at 12 years old in 2012. That would come years later. So I kind of used my position as someone who did get into this really, really early and who was in it for quite a long time to say, look, like, even just because you think that your countries are not going to go this direction, simply the fact that your kid is an English speaker who has internet access makes them extremely vulnerable. And here are the types of lessons that you should teach your kids at different stages of their development to try to inoculate them against these really harmful ideas, so that these really false beliefs don't just hijack the rest of their lives.
My name is Elle Palmer. Basically, when I was a kid, I was very feminine. And up until puberty hit, I had absolutely no issues with my gender or expression or any mental health issues at all. I had a pretty happy, good childhood. But when I was around 10, 11, I started developing really severe depression and anxiety. And it was around the time that puberty was starting for me. And I started going to see psychiatrists and doctors, being prescribed different medications like SSRIs. I was also diagnosed with ADHD and put on Ritalin. And then a year later, when I was 12, I ended up going to a children's mental hospital 2 different times because I was suicidal, I was self-harming, and I had severe mental illness at this point, so bad that I had dropped out of school because I couldn't handle the pressure. I had also, when I was in school, I was a gifted student. So I would get pulled out of class to go with a few other students to do harder work, which was also kind of adding on to the pressure that I felt from being in school. So going into middle school when I was 12 and 13, I had such severe anxiety that I just kept like telling my parents, like, I can't go to school, I have a stomach ache. And eventually this led me to another visit to the mental hospital because of how severe everything was getting for me in my life. So, and I stayed at that mental hospital for 3 months from age 13 to 14. And then it got a little bit better. I started feeling like, okay, maybe I could kind of move on from this period of my life and start improving like my depression and all that. But the mental hospital diagnosed me with bipolar. They put me on antipsychotics, they put me on benzodiazepines. So I was receiving this huge like cocktail of medications, which kind of sent the message to me that there was something wrong with me and I could use big pharma to fix it. Then at age 14, I was still dropped out of school. And so I was spending all my time on the internet. And I made a few online friends who started introducing me to other people, became part of their circle. And so I had this small circle of online friends on Twitter. And out of nowhere, I don't know who started it or where it came from, but a few people started changing their pronouns in bio. They started saying that they were they, them, non-binary, that sort of thing. And even a few of them came out as trans. And I had no idea what this was. So, you know, my friends coming out kind of made me go like, oh, what is this? Like, you know, is this something I relate to? So I started looking into it, and I eventually just, it's crazy because I was never like part of like peer pressure or like any sort of like social contagion before that. I was always very independent and like of my own mind, but for some reason this just latched on to me, and I ended up identifying as non-binary when I was 14. I just kept getting further and further into the ideology, further into politics as well. So, you know, naturally trans and politics, they go kind of hand in hand, especially in the mid 2010s. So around when I was 15, 2015, I came out as a trans boy, and uh, I spent like a year kind of convincing my parents of this. Um, and eventually, after a year, they said, "Okay, you still haven't gone to school. It's been like 3 years. Um, if we put you on testosterone, will you go to school?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, okay." So then, when I was 16, I started going to an alternative high school. My parents signed the paperwork to put me on testosterone. I went to Planned Parenthood for that. Um, and I ended up doing really well at the alternative high school. And, you know, looking back, I really wish that been given the chance to go to school as a girl first. So I wish I'd gone a little bit longer because I ended up building a lot of confidence there, and graduating in 2 years. So my entire high school experience was as a boy. And my first week of college, after I took a gap year, I detransitioned. So I was 19. And that's because I was going bald. I actually Googled how to stop balding as a trans man, because trans men go bald pretty fast. And I decided to stop testosterone. And I told myself, like, even if I regret it and want to go back on testosterone, like, I can always do that. But I'm going to keep losing hair. I'm going to keep getting these side effects that I don't like. So might as well stop now and see what happens. And that kind of began this like year-long journey of unpacking the ideology and deprogramming from it, um, unlearning all of the gender and politics that I had been, you know, fed for my entire teenage years. 5 years ago, I made a YouTube video about my detransition, and I went viral. And I was one of the first viral detransitioners, kind of this new generation. Um, and yeah, so I've been involved in the detrans scene for about 5 years, and recently started doing activism stuff about 4 months ago.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Abel Garcia. I'm a male detransitioner, one of the very few in this, I guess you can say, conversation. So I started my transition back in 2016. Oh my lord, it's almost been a decade. Oh god, I'm getting old. uh, so for me, the reason why I actually wanted to transition is, unfortunately, well, it's a lot of factors, but to make it a long story short, my parents came to the United States illegally from Mexico, and due to that, mostly my father, was busy working. I didn't have a good male role model. I was a very shy kid. I was very reserved, didn't really. I wasn't your stereotypically masculine boy growing up, and the fact that my dad wasn't in the picture didn't help out at all. So I know, with how I was as a kid and the fact that my father wasn't there to show me how to be a man, that made me confused and question myself. I know I'm a bit older compared to most of the detransitioners that we see nowadays, so I grew up before the internet was as popular as it is nowadays. So I wasn't really into the internet. I know a lot of our other detransitioners have gone on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and many others. I caught into this ideology through YouTube, right around middle when I was in middle school. I don't remember the exact age, unfortunately, but it was through YouTube that planted what I consider the seed of doubt in my head, or at least flourish the idea of me being it wanting to be transgender. Eventually, I was able to push everything aside to the back of my head until after I had left high school, gone into college, where I started to question myself. I did talk to a therapist and let her know I think I might be trans. I'm not sure. I just need some question. I just need some help because I was at this point a young 18-year-old, about to be 19-year-old young man who didn't really know anything about what he wanted to do in life. Well, that day, my therapist, on the same appointment for the first time I've ever seen her, said, "Yes, I am a transgender woman." She said she had my letter to transition right away and did not want to gatekeep me at all. I didn't accept her letter, but I worked with her because obviously I had no reason to doubt her as she was a medical professional. Sometime down that line, my father caught wind of what I was doing and took me to Mexico, where he forced me to sleep with a prostitute, which I which was sexual trauma, which I was unaware at the moment, which was the catalyst, which finally made me want to transition. A few months after that incident, I was able to leave my parents' house, and I started a prostitute transition. Everything went well. Hindsight being 2020. Less than a year into that transition, I was approved for what they call top and bottom surgery, which is breast implants for a man, and a vaginoplasty, which is a removal of my male genitals and creating a fake version of female genitals. I had informed this medical professional I don't want bottom surgery, vaginoplasty, whatever you want to call it. Unfortunately, they didn't care because it was an assembly line. Gave me my letter for both top and bottom surgery. Luckily, I did not get the bottom surgery or any form of that, because I know there besides vaginoplasty, there's also oki, or I cannot pronounce that word, but where they remove my testicles. I did not touch anything down there. And well, a few months after I got the implants, I woke up to the realization of this insanity, and while I was trying to get help, no medical professional wanted to assist me. My therapist told me that it was childhood traumas and that it was that I was just recovering from surgery. So that's why I wanted to detransition originally. Eventually, after her, I found another therapist, but unfortunately, it was the same as the first. They didn't want to help me. They just wanted to push their personal beliefs onto me. Eventually, I was able to get help by a third therapist who helped me, but we were now blocked by the insurance companies, and well, they didn't want to help us either. So after a while, I was able to get the insurance company to cover everything, which thankfully they did. Now, I originally started speaking out January of 2020, and I've been speaking out ever since then. So a little over 5 years now.
Laura Becker, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Matt. It's good to be back. So I am a detransitioner and an advocate on behalf of survivors of the gender mutilation industry, as well as a life coach to parents, detransitioners. I do consulting work to help people figure out how to help themselves with their detransition process, or helping their families deal with a ideologically captured child who is in the transgender cult. I have experience with this because I actually lived through a medical transition and detransition. So I was identifying as transgender from about the age of 17 until 22. I took testosterone and I had my breasts removed. And then I was diagnosed with PTSD from the transition, as well as, of course, core traumas that led to me disassociating from my body. And I detransitioned at the age of 22. And for the last 6 years, I've been on the front lines speaking out against the gender mutilation industry and trying to find resources and create resources for survivors and their families to be able to not only heal gender dysphoria, but also prevent more mutilation happening for the vulnerable in our society.
And Exulansic, welcome back to the program as well. Can you just introduce yourself briefly for listeners who aren't familiar with you?
I identified as trans for a number of years and detransitioned, and after several years of the hormone therapies, including the overlapping portion where they had been multiple at one time, I was also diagnosed with PTSD around the time I was starting to detransition and have my brief non-binary phase and then move on. And years went by and I got involved in the detrans movement.
And Maia, do you feel like you're getting more attention? Do you think that detransitioners are being seen more? I can say, for example, that you are being seen by the opposition in the sense that they are trying very hard to make up a reason to dislike you and turn you into a monster of some sort or a buffoon. And that means that you're dangerous to them. They wouldn't do that unless you were dangerous. So do you think that you're getting more attention?
I mean, objectively speaking, yeah, I'm getting quite a bit of attention. Like, I think that what's important to really keep in mind is that who does the kind of trans activist movement see as a really big threat? And it's not just detransitioners, by the way. It is detransitioners, obviously. Like, otherwise they wouldn't be coming after us in this way. But it's also current trans people who are against the dogma of the trans activist movement. So even people like Blair White and Buck Angel, they're also targets of this same exact movement. I mean, they're spoken about in extremely derogatory terms as well. So it's and the reason why is because there are levels of apostasy, and even in religions like Islam, and I do compare, the trans activist religion often to Islam because there are such similar kind of enforcement mechanisms and tactics that they use to compel speech and to sort of censor dissenting stories. And so there are levels of apostasy, and you don't have to have been trans ever to be considered an apostate, but the apostates that they consider most dangerous are the ones who are either currently trans or who used to be trans. And I think this is because, frankly, like, I mean, our stories threaten their narrative, and their narrative is, on the one hand, extremely simplistic, which is, like, if you have any type of discomfort around your sex body, or actually whether you don't, because gender dysphoria is like no longer a requirement to be trans. So if you say you're trans, you're trans. And then, of course, if you stop saying you're trans, it means you were never trans. So they're trying to grapple with this really wide net they've cast for kind of in-group inclusion. If this wide net that they cast, if it catches tons of people, and then some portion of those people realize, like, oh wait, this life path that you guys have been prescribing as the only path through which I could achieve happiness is actually a flawed one, then they become really angry at you for pointing it out. But I would say that it's important for people who are currently trans identifying and currently transitioning, alongside those of us who have transitioned and then disembarked from our gender journeys. I think it's equally important, actually, for both of us to give our perspectives, because there are a multiplicity of experiences regarding transition and detransition. And I think that, the reality, actually, as I see it, is that gender ideology, it's harmful to everyone, and it's very harmful to people who are gender dysphoric, whether they want to pursue transition or not. And currently the dogma is that, if you are gender dysphoric, the only coping mechanism you have is this series of social, legal, medical, and surgical sex obfuscations. And this is a really harmful and pseudoscientific approach to treating gender dysphoria. I mean, we don't actually have the evidence that transition even is the best pathway. Certainly, we don't have any evidence testing to the fact that it's the only way that this type of distress can be treated. But I think that, any of us who are speaking out against this, especially those of us who used to be believers and are now non-believers, we're cast as infidels. And what do infidels deserve? Well, first you try to distance yourself from the infidels, and then you try to discredit them and threaten violence against them, because that's what high control groups do to infidels. So yeah, we're getting a lot of attention, and alongside people like Blair White and Buck Angel, and there are plenty of other so-called old school transsexuals who would happen to agree with us, who have seen this community that they entered a very long time ago become totally unrecognizable to them. And I think their stories matter. I think like the gender critical side, is basically of the opinion, like, don't trust anyone who is currently trans identified. Don't trust anyone who hasn't detransitioned. But I actually don't share that opinion. I think you just need to understand that every single person who has gotten involved with transition in any capacity, whether they stop it or whether they continue upon it, they need to have like a possibility model for how to embrace their sex. And I think it's actually important both for people who have like so-called like fully medically transitioned, they no longer have their gonads, they no longer have, body parts, or they couldn't conceivably pass as a member of their biological sex anymore, whether they choose to detransition, whatever that means to them, or whether they choose to keep transitioning. I think that the ultimately the best outcome for any individual is to acknowledge that they are a member of the sex that they actually are, and to have a reality based understanding of what transition can and can't do, so that they can actually accept themselves rather than kind of endlessly comparing themselves to members of the sex category to which they do not belong, and always feeling like they can't measure up. Like that creates an extreme amount of neuroticism and anxiety. And so I think it's beneficial for there to be a multiplicity of, transition and detransition stories out there, so that people can, keep people who are considering embarking upon this path, now that, we don't have doctors that actually want to inform patients or to safeguard patients in any way, for there to at least be a bunch of accounts online for people to really look through and see, okay, like, here are the things that these doctors might tell me, and here are the things that all these influencers might be telling me, and here's the other side. So I just think it's helpful, for there to be like a multiplicity of stories like ours. And yeah, of course we do threaten, the beliefs of the trans activist dogma, which is pushed by both trans identified people and people who are not trans identified, who are not transitioning. And all of those trans activists, regardless of their identity claims, or regardless of the, procedures they may or may not have done, they have a very specific pseudoscientific dogma that they want to push. And it requires all of us to really be a counter force to that, to inject a little bit of common sense and sanity into those narratives.
Yeah, definitely. I started identifying as queer in 2012, not as transgender yet, but I was steeped in the transgender community. Pretty much all of my friends, my social world was some form of queer or trans. And I had never heard of detransitioning. I had never heard of transition regret. I was completely convinced that did not exist, that if you're truly transgender, nobody would transition unless they're truly transgender. And if you're truly transgender, you're never going to regret it. So I had never heard of it until my partner at the time experienced transition regret. And that was in 2019. So and since then I meet people who actually know what this is, who have heard of that. And that was completely unheard of just a few years ago. So I do think there's a huge cultural shift. And then especially I think since the election, it's gone, this whole election process, gender, transgender was such a huge campaign topic, that I think the detransitioning stories are also much more public and much more well known. For me, it was all about the ideology. So I identified as an ally long before I started identifying as transgender myself. And I was introduced to a transgender person for the first time, I believe, in 2008. And I started identifying as an ally to that person and to transgender individuals and the transgender movement in general shortly after that. So I was steeped in an ideological environment, and it became more and more religious. Basically, it started to become my religion. I used to be an evangelist. I grew up evangelical Christian, and I was very passionate evangelizing people. I wanted them to convert to my faith. And once I stepped into the queer ideology, the queer gender ideology, I became sort of an evangelist too. I would have arguments with people and try to convince them. So I think one of the reasons I'm hated is because I wasn't just identified as transgender, I was more or less an activist as well. I perpetuated the ideology. I encouraged people to transition. So I was really one of the trans ideologues. I wasn't just, especially since I'm older, I wasn't just, pulled into it in my teens. But I was very actively promoting the ideology as an evangelist, preacher almost. And, I'd get into arguments online with people. I got into arguments in person. I distanced myself from people who would not support gender ideology in the ways that I thought they should. I would tell them that they were harming people by not being as trans supportive. I would correct people on pronouns. I would preach about the importance of using correct pronouns, etc. So I was very, very ideologically in it before I even identified as transgender myself. I was basically a true believer. I started out as a anti-gay activist. Basically, I was raised in a very anti-gay religious environment, and I'd spend time arguing with people that they're going to hell because they're gay. I literally told that to people. I would advocate for, God created humans to be heterosexual, and if you're homosexual, there's something really wrong with you. And if God will fix that if you let God fix that. And if you insist on being gay, then, there's no way you can not go to hell. Right. And I later faced a lot of regret over that. I was like, oh gosh, like how many people have I, yelled at sometimes, telling them that they're going to hell, or at least argued with and told them that God can't love them the way they are. And so I had a lot of regret. And I then, I actually came to terms with the fact that I am not only attracted to men, I'm also attracted to women. So I eventually came to accept that I have bisexual attractions. And I came out to identify as bisexual. And then I basically tried to undo the harm that I had done. And I became kind of involved in LGB activism before the T was very prominent. And then we started winning. Right. Like I remember, when San Francisco was all lit up in rainbow colors because we had marriage equality, and and it felt incredible. Felt kind of like I was, reconciling the harm that I had done. It felt really good. But then there was this, it basically became an addiction, because now I was fighting on the right side, and I was fighting, against the wrong side that I had been on. I was like, now I can like erase the negative that I had done. And then when we started winning and we started having all these protections, we started having all of these gay rights and privileges that we've been fighting for, we just kept going. It's like we became addicted to the fight. We became addicted to being on the right side and to undoing, where we had come from. And so we just kept going, and we just kept, when the trans issue came on the table, it was almost like some of us, including myself, went, oh, good, here's where we can keep fighting. It was just like that was my identity at this point. I'm fighting for, civil rights. I'm fighting for, LGBTQ. And when we added more letters, even better, there's more to fight for. So it became pretty much an addiction and an identity. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that's very real. And there's just a lot of this impulse to try to undo the past, and also to basically give the next generation the things that we didn't have. But when I look around now, when we were in DC, we had this reception at the Heritage Foundation, and the liberal in me was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to step into the building of the Heritage Foundation. I can't believe this. And then I get up there and there's all these gays. there's this whole group of gay men up there who were advocating for things in DC, and they were hosted by the Heritage Foundation. And that just blew my mind. That would not have happened 20 years ago. And so there's this lack of recognition that the world has actually changed. The Christian right is so much more tolerant of people just being gay and lesbian than they were 20 years ago. Sure, there's still groups, there's still issues, but it's a different world we're living in. And in a lot of ways, I feel like on the left, we were fighting a fight we had already won. And so then we were just, when you're not under attack anymore, your defense becomes an offense. If your attacker is no longer attacking you, then you're the one who's perpetuating the war. You're no longer defending yourself, trying to just get to victory and peace. And that's what I felt like we were doing. And there's just this lack of recognition that the world is a different world now. And that, in the beginning, that what drew me to the queer movement was that there was so much tolerance for gender divergence. I was always a tomboy. I was a pretty masculine woman. And I loved the fact that in this setting, I got to be this way. I loved that I could, just express my masculine more, and that I could just be gender nonconforming. And the queer movement, when I first got involved in it, just felt like a safe haven. I could be same-sex attracted. I could be both. I could be masculine, I could be feminine, I could experiment. There was a playfulness, and it just felt like the movement got hijacked. That playfulness went away, and now it's all about having to fix that there's something wrong with you. It's no longer an exploration, a playful exploration of all the different ways that you can be, and to celebrate these different ways of being. Now it's a fix what's wrong with you. And if you can't get the fix, we all have to fight for fixing all the wrongs, and how there's all these things wrong with ourselves and with children. So it just feels like the movement itself has taken a radical turn, for the worse. And I would actually love to see that playfulness restored, that exploration, the gender queerness, what it originally meant, which was just the exploration of different ways of being based on what else can I be, rather than how do I fix what's wrong with me.
It was amazing. I was really looking forward to catching up with most of the friends that I have made through the detrans community. I feel like Detrans Awareness Day is probably the biggest event for detransitioners to come together in person. And since I've been in the community for over 5 years, I have come to know pretty much everyone who does activism stuff. But it was my first time meeting a few people like Abel. So it was really cool. But yeah, I got to catch up with a few of the friends that I've been able to get close to. And when all the detransitioners are together, it's always really fun. We do some stupid shit. But yeah, the actual events were also interesting because I like to see people from outside the detrans community get involved in detransition activism and gender ideology, fighting. So I really like meeting people who are either experts in their field, doctors, scientists, whatever the case may be, who have realized that this stuff is crazy and that we need more people fighting it. I also had the pleasure of meeting quite a few parents who have kids going through this, which is always really sad and hard. But me being able to kind of be like a shining light, or like kind of a model for how their kid could, eventually come to the realization, I think helps them a lot. So it was really nice to meet those people.
I would say DC went very well. We had a great time in the beginning with the panel with myself and many others on the panel for the detransitioners explaining their perspective. And before that, we had the medical board, many other medical professionals, and a detransitioner giving their experience. We had a social media panel that went great. Overall, the day went well. Then we split up, I know, between two groups, one for the Department of Education, one with Representative Dan Crenshaw. Both of us, both groups, obviously being able to talk about the medical harm done to us and hope. And obviously, I can't speak for the Department of Education because I wasn't there, but I know for the Dan Crenshaw event where I attended, we were able to speak with Representative Crenshaw for a bit and briefly explain to him what we've been through. Overall, I would say the event went great. I got to meet up with a lot of my friends who I've met over the last couple of years, like Chloe Cole, Laura Becker. Got to meet some new friends like Elle, who I've known on social media, but we have never met personally. Got to meet in person. Uh, Obviously, like Elle mentioned, we do have a lot of great individuals who are involved in this that are not detransitioners, but are experts in their field, like good doctors, parents who are obviously concerned who've had kids, their own kids in this. And overall, the event again great. I also had some spare time on my last day there to go into the halls of Congress and speak to not elected officials, but as they had all left, but to speak with their staff and obviously try to speak with them regarding this topic. Even had the opportunity to speak with my elected official staff, which will shock some people. My elected official is Jasmine Crockett.
Yeah, so it was super, super cool. We had, I think, 6 detransitioners there. We had Claire Abernathy, Simon Amaya Price, Soren Aldalco, Luca Heim, and me. And and Laura Becker. Laura, Simon, and Claire all got to speak in front of the Secretary of Education and then tell their stories, which was super cool. She joined us for about 15 minutes out of the like roughly hour-long meeting. So she heard from us and she heard from a few of the members of organizations who are trying to fight this stuff alongside us. It seemed like she really cared and she was really interested in, hearing what we had to say. I'm not exactly sure, if she's going to implement anything or how, our stories have affected her, but we did get an article written on us by a journalist who was present at the meeting as well. But there was also, along with everyone else in the meeting, there was the senior representative to Robert Kennedy, and he stayed for the whole meeting, and he works directly under RFK. So he was taking furious notes on what, RFK can do, what Trump can do to start fixing these things for us urgently. So one thing that some of the detransitioners really hammered home was that we need insurance coverage for detransitioners, and that we need codes, and that we need more people willing to work with us, like Abel was saying, because the reversal care for the harm that gender affirming care has caused us is very real. It's very hard to get covered, and a lot of medical professionals won't even touch us. So that is one thing that we were able to really make our point on. But there were quite a few other things brought up, very many important things that I think we're really going to see, Trump start to focus on, RFK start to focus on. The advisor said that Trump is making gender ideology a number one priority in his presidency. So that's pretty exciting.
Very good. Do you have anything else you want to add, Abel, about the experience of DC?
I believe that's mostly it. Like I said, I was able to. I had a great time. Everything went well. It's always good to see old friends and make new friends. And like I said, mostly just spent my last few hours running around the halls of Congress trying to convince Democrats like we're not here to be the genocidal maniacs that the media paint us as. We're just obviously concerned individuals who have been harmed and lied to by a medical system, but obviously got to word it in a way that they'll like. Unlike the Republicans, where you can just be blunt with them, like, yeah, no, this shit's insane. Excuse my language, but
So, do you feel that more people are listening to detransitioners now than before? Do you feel like there's more attention on the cause, on the effects on you? We'll start with you.
Yeah, I'd say it's played a huge role for me. Uh, I started before I ever thought I was trans or non-binary. I started as a leftist, a feminist. So I was already in those kind of political circles. Um, I didn't really know what that meant at the time. I was so young, like being 13, 14, just kind of assumed like, yeah, like feminism means you want equal rights, and leftism means that you just care about everybody, just very basic kind of ideas. And then transgenderism starting to be kind of eaten up by the left, starting to become one of their core issues. I started getting more and more uh radicalized, I guess you could say. Started moving further left and started getting more into politics. Um, so a big part of my deprogramming after detransitioning was realizing, okay, what's reality and what's fiction? Because I've just been kind of fed the same lines over and over of this is how it is and this is how it should be without really thinking too much about it as in terms of politics and in terms of the gender ideology. But as far as during my transition, I would say the reason why I was able to get on hormones as a 16-year-old is because I had a therapist who was the head of the LGBT center in my town. She was an older lesbian, but she was very passionate about trans kids, and I don't really know why, but she saw me at 16 with short hair, looking like a little, preteen boy and thinking you are, you know, this perfect idea of a little trans boy and you need to transition. Like she would tell me, like on our first session that we ever had, I told her the story of how I realized that I was trans, um, which involved many of the things that I talked about earlier with my mental illness. And her reaction was, I can just tell by the way that your eyes light up when you're talking about being a boy that it's really true. And I just think about that sometimes, and I just think about how crazy that is because if she wasn't, ideologically captured by this, it's kind of like, how could you listen to this kid talk about being so mentally ill? They can't even go to school and they're still not even in school. And you think that this is the right time to put them on a completely different hormonal path while they're still going through puberty. And it's just crazy to think about looking back, you know, out of the ideology, just how these people think. But my whole family, like I said, they're all still leftists. They all still support gender ideology. Some of them still support kids transitioning. Uh, and so sometimes I kind of have to put myself back in their shoes and kind of think like, how could I get through to somebody who still believes this and kind of communicate it in a way that's neutral enough to have an impact on them, kind of get through them and not just be dismissed as, rhetoric from the right, something like that.
I would say for me, so before I even started this transition, I actually had no political leaning. I wasn't left, I wasn't right. But the more I got into this ideology, I became further and further left. One thing that just caught me by surprise was what Elle mentioned about her therapist, who was an older lesbian running who was the head of the LGBT clinic at her area. Funny enough, actually, my therapist was also the head of the LGBT clinic in my area, as well as an older lesbian. and mine actually also ran the transgender support group. Now, I'm not gonna say anything that would be considered conflict of interest, but that does sound a little bit of a suspicious, if you ask me. If you're both the head of the LGBT clinic, but also the head of the transgender support group. But yeah, no, my therapist had also, like I mentioned earlier, told me yes, I was a transgender woman on my first appointment, and I didn't wake up or at least look into politics a different light until halfway in through my transition, where I realized not everything is perfect on the left side. So I was looking into the right side of politics, and that's when I realized I started to at least change my politics a little more. Now, I will say regarding other individuals within the LGBT community, I did have an older male to female transgender who was at my health clinic when I was talking to my doctor, and he had me stand up and give him a little twirl. And he said after that he could tell I was supposed to be a woman.
We were all presented with an ideology through our university, which was shared, and then the medical system had its own ideology that was disseminated through the WPATH standards of care, which I believe at the time they were on standards of care 6 that I began care. And the care I received was mentioned in it. So yeah, we all felt like it was our job to carry it forward, that this was the new scientific frontier. I had my own pet theory of exactly how it all made sense on a physical level. That I think eventually is what probably led me out of it. But for a while there, I thought that I had the next big idea.
Well, I have a memoir that's coming out later this year, and I titled it Surviving the Trans Myth. It's exactly because the transgender ideology is a mythology. It's a set of spiritual beliefs, intellectual beliefs that, as Exulansic said, are perpetrated through academia, and then in the K through 12 school system, and then in the fringe activist circles like WPATH. And so the pseudoscience is passed off as legitimate. And because the trans movement was fringe to begin with, and it started out in a fringe kind of sexological environment, now it's been called the only path forward. It's the only treatment for, or the best practice, quote unquote, for gender issues. And obviously now we have a counter narrative to that we don't actually have good data on that. And we have a lot of survivors that are saying, hey, not only are these standards of care not actually effective, but a lot of times people aren't even following them anyway. So we have a wild west of medicine that we're working very hard to ameliorate. And the ideology is said to be the only treatment for this so-called disease, when in reality, now we're seeing this disease is actually a very broad sort of existential thread, as it were, this idea of dysphoria. Dysphoria just means distress. So people feel distress in their bodies. That could mean anything, but because the ideology is very popular right now, people are saying, oh, maybe it's that. And then the one size fits all approach is to affirm and say, yes, it is that. Okay, time for surgery now.
Is it your sense that there are more detransitioners now? Is the number growing, Laura?
Yeah, the number of detransitioners is just growing and growing. I mean, I'm getting messages every day, every week from new people that are saying, hey, I did this thing and now I don't know what to do. And more parents reaching out to me in my coaching practice, asking for help. And they want their kids to be able to have alternative resources to just being transitioned and harmed. So I started out kind of, 6 years ago, detransitioned in 2019, and there was only a couple high profile detransitioners making YouTube videos and things like that. Now it's at the point where every week there's more people coming out, and as these people start to heal and as they see others like ourselves out in the mainstream and actually getting real help, they feel confident to then share their stories, because unlike before, there really are safety nets now where we have actual community, actual resources, and to be able to help them when they are brave enough to share their experiences. So I think we're just going to see more and more emerging, because we've built that stable foundation now where they can see that the path forward is clear. We've kind of forged a path, and now we're able to help people along this process, whereas before there was really nothing.
Yeah, I see it as kind of just like it's a wave. So there's some continuous rate of new detransitioners per year. That would be the incidence. And then over time, the prevalence is going to grow because it's a new phenomenon. And eventually it'll reach some stable rate as you get to the point where it's lasted long enough, assuming this actually lasts long enough for this to happen, which I hope it doesn't. But if it did, we're not at like a stable prevalence. So yeah, the prevalence is going to be growing over time for some time, and until it's existed long enough for people to be dying off from it. And how long that will be, I don't know, because a lot of these interventions do shorten lifespan considerably.
Yeah, for sure. And for now, there's definitely this whole new generation, of people who started identifying as transgender as teenagers. There's definitely some differences between the kids from my perspective in my 40s, and then those who transition like much earlier, who those of us who transition in our 30s and 40s. It's just that whole social contagion, and seeing whole friends group transition. That's part of what woke me up, is that I saw like a whole group of teenage girls all just becoming trans together. I'm like, wait, what? Like, what is this? That's not how it was, 15 years ago, or even 20 years ago, when I, like that was not how transgender worked back then. It was isolated individuals. And that was part of what startled me. And I think that's, we're seeing that a lot of the detransitioners are much younger. But then also there's all these older detransitioners. I'm a moderator for a detransition group online, and I'm always surprised when I see these people who transitioned 20, 30 years ago detransitioning now, especially men who lived as trans women for 20 years and longer, who are now choosing to detransition. And when I ask them, like, why are you detransitioning so long? You've put like 25 years into this, why now? And the answer I consistently get is that the ideology is really bothering them too. They just kind of wanted to be trans and left alone. And what we're seeing now, these swaths of people transitioning and groups of young people transitioning together, they're appalled by that. And so some of them are choosing to detransition even after all of those years, because they don't want to be associated with what's happening now.
Well, I think that, so in the same way as there's a social contagion around gender dysphoria and around adopting trans identities, that's currently the zeitgeist, I think there's also going to be a social contagion of detransition, because people are pack animals, and that goes both ways. I mean, there's definitely a wave of detransition, and in response to this wave of detransition, there are also, and this I totally expected to happen, because I know how these young people work, because I used to be one of them. I think that, there's definitely going to be, and we're already starting to see this, in response to this detrans wave, another wave of young people identifying as trans, like a wave of young people who were allies, and then they adopt these trans beliefs about themselves specifically, in response to, like, people like myself, like Annika, like Chloe or Elle or Abel, like, people like us who share our stories. They're determined to prove that they're not going to end up like us. And so, like, I've definitely been starting to see that, um like a new resurgence of trans activism.
I think so. Um, simply because more people, well, not simply because, but I think one of the reasons is because as more people start to speak out and as the mainstream awareness of this issue grows, I think more people realize, like, for one, there are good results from detransitioning. I passed fully, and I was fully stealth as a man, because I was so masculine and I had a full beard, I had chest hair, I had the baritone voice, like everything. Um, but now on the other side, 6 years into detransitioning, even less, I was already passing as a woman again, um, within a year or two after stopping testosterone. And I just had no idea what was going to happen because there was barely anyone who was out in public doing detrans stuff, much less even just, posting online about it. Like most of the people that I met on the detrans subreddit 5 years ago when I joined 5, 6 years ago were within months of beginning their detransition. There was pretty much nobody that I met who would already been detransitioning for a year or more. It was a very, very new movement. And now you've got people like me, people like Abel, who are, over 5 years in, who can kind of speak to these younger and newer detransitioners and say like, hey, this is going to be okay. You're going to get through this. I think that gives more people the kind of reassurance. Um, but yeah, I mean, knowing that there's like an active community, I think that helped me a lot. And I'm sure that helps other people too. Um, but yeah, I mean, I still get message after message, comment after comment on my social medias and on my YouTube channel, where pretty much every day, at least, somebody will tell me that I helped them realize that they needed to detransition. And if I tallied up every single comment and every single message that I have ever gotten from somebody that told me that I'm the reason why they detransitioned, that would already far exceed the number of detransitioners that trans people think there are. It's crazy. It's so crazy.
She is right. When both of us came out originally 5 years ago, there was nothing. Actually, when I started to start this process to detransition, I had looked online. There was very few people who would talk about this topic. There's not many individuals that I could have reached out. There was one person who I was able to reach out to who had been detransitioning for decades, but this was an older individual before all this insanity had started, or at least taken a hold of our society the way it has. But I think the important thing nowadays, like compared for these younger folks that are transitioning and detransitioning, is at least they have people to look up to, like Elle and myself. Because I know when Elle, like Elle said, we couldn't have reached reached out to someone who's like, hey, I see that you've been detransitioning for at least a year, maybe five. Like, what would you recommend for me to get to do to make this process easy? There was nobody we could have spoken to like that. So Elle, myself, and many others had to be the ones who had to pave that road for everyone nowadays. Obviously, I know I don't have the same uh, audience like Elle, so I don't get those messages every other day from people. But I know obviously people are going to be watching my videos, watching my testimonies, my conversation, and though I can at least use that as a stepping stone, because I know, yeah, the conversation on this topic is mostly young women transitioning to men and then detransitioning back to women compared to the men who transition to women and detransition back to men. It's it's I'd say 10 to 1 on the female to men, but at least I know of a young man who transitions to a woman and sees my stuff like because he's feeling hopeless and his transition isn't what he was promised, which is what I was promised: sunshine and rainbows. The world would see me as a woman, and yeah, the world didn't recognize me as a woman, but in reality is I was never one. But I'm glad that at least my voice is out there, at least for the last 5 years. So these young men, they can at least see my growth from a young man who just removed his implants, cut his hair, grew out a beard, and now 5 years ago, I know that I didn't really have much hope, and now I'm gonna get married soon, have a happy wife, and if everything goes well, we'll have a happy family with 15 little mini Abels running around.
Man, that's a big question. That's a really big question. I mean, I'm constantly surprised by who listens and who doesn't listen. I get messages from my some of my former friends, and I expect this one demographic to be willing to listen, and then they totally don't, and then this other demographic I've written off, and they come to the table and they want to listen. So I'm in a process of being surprised, and sorting out, like, what do the people who listen have in common. For one thing, I think they tended to not be as radical beforehand, and there's an emotional maturity in people who are listening, because it does require going through a lot of regret. I had to go through that regret myself. Like, just thinking about how many people did I encourage into transitioning? How many people did I convert? And now having to regret that. So there's a certain strength of character that's needed to face that regret. And I think that's also why we're seeing people come around on the women's sports issue earlier than other things. You would think it would be more the childhood transitioning thing, that we could all agree that 12-year-olds can't consent to these medical treatments. But that's where we're actually seeing more resistance. But then we're seeing Democrats coming around to, this whole, like males and women's sports thing. That's not fair. I can see that. I'm in support of, keeping women's sports for females only. And I think the reason that is because it's a lower bar. Like, there's a lower threshold, like acknowledging that you've caused unfairness in sports is not as painful as acknowledging that you have caused medical harm, amputations, mutilations in children. That's a much, much higher threshold of regret, and having to revise your self-image of how good a person you are and how righteous of a cause you've fought. So I think I think, as much as I want to see fast and radical change, I do think that focusing on the issues that are a little bit easier to stomach, and celebrating the victories that are had there, especially in the sports department, and starting there and just actually being supportive of people changing their mind, even in small ways. I do think that has value. Like, I definitely want to see the broader changes, but I also, having gone through it myself, I do know that it can be really difficult to see yourself in that light, and to see, like, oh my goodness, what have I done? What have I been complicit in, at the very least, or what have I even perpetuated? And it's a real knock to one's identity, especially if you've been an activist thinking you were advocating for the good, and you were doing things out of compassion, and you were making the world a better place. And then to turn around and look at, wow, no, I've actually caused a lot of harm and hurt a lot of people. That's not an easy step to take.
What is it going to take to get people on board? I mean, it's going to take a multiplicity of voices. Like, what's unfortunate is that, because the right wing is the only one who cares really about this issue at this point in any kind of meaningful way. Of course, they're going to pick characters who they see as most sympathetic, not just to their position on transition and detransition, but their other political positions. So it's harder for someone who is like not conforming to this kind of traditional Christian way of life, for them to get as big of a platform. And I think that that's a really big flaw in the way that this issue is being handled. There needs to be like a much bigger platform given to, like, first of all, to male detransitioners, because they're being totally, like, they're getting totally screwed here. Like, people are significantly less likely to see men and boys as victims. They're more likely to see them as like these gross evil perverts. And so this is a really big problem, because actually the biggest victims of gender medicine until maybe about 10 years ago were actually boys and men. It's only very recent that we've had this wave of teenage girls coming out and transitioning, and then some of them detransitioning. So there needs to be a lot more emphasis placed on the stories of these boys and young men, because they are an emerging cohort, of younger transitioners, especially, that we didn't see as much 10 years ago. Also, I think there needs to be, more emphasis placed on the stories of, for example, like gay and lesbian detransitioners, because I know that what woke me up, I mean, ideologically, a large part of what woke me up was understanding, that this ideology is so harmful to gay people. And like when I identified as trans, like obviously I was so young. I was really obsessed with the gay rights movement, which by then was focused on things like marriage. And I was really obsessed with a couple like lesbian personalities like Jane Lynch and Ellen DeGeneres. And I think what started feeding me the trans content was actually the fact that I watched so much Ellen DeGeneres on YouTube, that because it's all lumped together as LGBT, I started getting, like less and less content about gay and lesbian public figures and about the movement in general. And I started getting more and more content that basically exalted transition and trans identities. And so I think that that's a story that needs to be told of like the gay and lesbian young people who are being totally screwed by this ideology, because this might be the thing that wakes up these like like supporters of gay marriage who just are going along with trans because they see it as kind of gay 2.0, and making that distinction and showing like, well, actually this ideology is extremely harmful to young gays and lesbians. And if we get that message out, and this message has not been super widely discussed, there are some figures who have talked about the impact of this ideology on young gays and lesbians, but they talk about it more in the abstract. Maybe they talk about it from their perspective as an older gay or lesbian who might have had some gender confusion, but not someone who actually got sucker punched into this ideology as a young person and then transitioned and then was harmed by this process psychosocially, physically, medically, surgically, whatever the case may be. So there need to be like more stories of like gay and lesbian transitioners, because this might be the only thing that wakes up these liberals who supported gay marriage and then supported gender ideology because they saw it as being kind of the same fight. There's a lot of complicity within our society. Like this ideology could not have so thoroughly invaded every single one of our institutions had it not been for the fact that within every single identitarian subgroup within our society, there was some contingent that was really hell bent on pushing it. And yes, this does include within the gay and lesbian community. There are like, gay and lesbian activists who are saying, oh yeah, like we never had anything to do with this. This is like not, not in our name. And I understand the impulse to sort of separate oneself from this brutal ideology, but also like gay and lesbian communities absolutely pushed this ideology. Not every single person within them. These organizations that gays and lesbians had grown to trust because of the gay marriage battle, they started to adopt these positions on gender ideology, and a lot of those gays and lesbians just kind of went along with it because they trusted those organizations. We can't pretend, just because it's politically incorrect, we can't pretend that that didn't happen. Like, does that mean that all gays and lesbians always supported it? No. But like, we can't pretend that no gays and lesbians supported this. So that's like one thing. But we also need to acknowledge that this extremely rigid set of rules around gender and sex and conformity within the Christian right, and just within religion in general, these attitudes were also extremely harmful in bringing about the belief that, oh yeah, like if a little boy likes pink and sparkles, the left is going to say, oh, maybe it means he has a girl soul inside of him, and the right would say, oh, that there's he's behaving in a way that boys shouldn't behave. And we can't just pretend that only one side of this has been pushing attitudes and beliefs that are really, really harmful and that have allowed us to get to this place. And we need to be able to find fault in every single sector of society where it exists, and it exists everywhere. Because again, if there was some social force that had nothing to do with this ideology would not have been so pervasive. Like, we know that in the case of Kai Shapley, who I believe is 13 or 14 by now, a trans-identified child, his mom saw that her son was extremely effeminate And she used to spank him. She used to beat him to try to behave in a more boyish way until, of course, she was introduced to the idea that her son has a girl brain inside of his boy body. And then she was like, oh, it was such a relief that we didn't have to like beat our child anymore. Like, because really our child, there's nothing wrong with him. It's just that he's a girl. That's the thing about him that's wrong is his maleness. So now we fixed that, right? So like we really have to have a very sober understanding about the fact that both these like highly restrictive notions of how boys and girls can be and what they can do, both when it comes from a religious perspective or when it comes from this weird set of postmodern woke ideological inversions.
Yeah, I believe a lot of people are now starting to listen to us. Obviously, 5 years ago, when Elle and I both came out on social media and the internet, and we were talking about our the harm done to us, I don't think there was that many people who knew what kind of harm was done to us, who we were, or anything about us. But obviously, as time passes and more individuals speak out about the harm done to them, like myself, Elle, Chloe, Laura, Chloe, and many others. I think that helps us out. That helps us out a lot. Obviously, it's good when elected officials like Representative Crenshaw, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, and even the president himself are saying this is something that we need to talk about. This is the high priority. So, and even the Democrat Party, there some of them are even going against them. Here in the state of Texas, back in 2023, we had a Democrat elected representative from Houston by the name of Sean Theory who spoke out against her own party and has been kicked out by her party on the Democrat side, replaced by a more far left individual who I doubt would even listen to us, which I have to give a Sean Theory credit where credit is due. As a Democrat, she was willing to sit down, listen to me in her office, and show me around the state capitol in Austin with other, and let me speak with other elected officials who gave me the opportunity to speak. So it is very good that now a lot of more people are listening to this and are willing to listen, while on both sides are giving this conversation more of the attention it needs.
Abel, I think that was very well said. I agree with you on the assessment that 5 years ago it was very, very different. I have been thinking about this lately, and I personally believe that this movement is bigger and stronger and getting more attention than ever at this very moment. I think being involved in activism right now is more important than it's ever been and is going to continue to grow as this year continues. And as, Trump is putting more attention on this, a lot more of the government is starting to get involved in this. But I do remember that 5 years ago when I started making videos and I went viral, I was getting invitations to speak on bills, to go to different states and tell my story, but I didn't ever take anyone up on that stuff. I just was not ready to be so public and to start speaking on politics because I was still convinced that there was a way for us to separate the detrans movement from politics. But as time went on, I started to realize that that was just not true. Right now, and for the past 5 years, honestly, Republicans have been pretty much the only ones listening to us and starting to enact this legislation. And it's really, really hard as a former Democrat, as a person with a full family of Democrats still. It's hard for them to wrap their heads around the fact that I'm a conservative now simply because of this single issue, because the Democrats just don't care. thankfully, Abel said some of them are starting to listen to us, telling our stories, but pretty much every single bill gets voted along party lines, which means that the Republicans are the ones passing these bills banning children from transitioning, while the Democrats stay voting for them, being pro child mutilation, because they don't want to deviate from their party and become that scapegoat like Abel was talking about. I think it's going to continue to get bigger and for more people to realize that they can speak out, but right now it's, it's still kind of a controversial issue at the moment.
That's Elle just added a great point as well, because she mentioned that obviously when she first came out and speaking on this topic, not many people wanted to listen to her because she was more of a Democrat. That's actually one thing I've noticed a lot in the years that I've been in this. A lot of individuals here are not what you would think. They're not all Republicans. Actually, a good amount of it's actually split 50-50, Democrat and Republicans. Obviously, if you listen to the media, you're going to think it's all far right MAGA Trump supporters who want to get rid of all uh, these health cares that for trans people that have been proven safe and effective, which is not what it is. In reality, as many doctors have said, a lot of this medicine that they claim that it's safe and effective and help was actually not. It's still experimental, and even my own family. I was a Democrat for a long time. My family are still Democrats. I have many friends who are Democrats who don't understand what I'm doing, who don't like what I'm doing. And I told them like, I'm not a far right conservative. I lean a bit more on the right, but it's not just the trans topic. There's many other reasons why I lean more towards the right compared to the left. But the one of the main two reasons why I vote more right than left is because of this trans ideology. Like, obviously, I've been hurt by it, but my family, who are all of Mexican descent, some who are U.S. citizens, some who are still illegal, they will only listen to the Democrat Party because they think Trump is evil in himself, so they won't care on this one topic because they have their own concerns.
Are the numbers growing, Elle?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think you have a better chance of pulling the teeth out of an alligator while it's not sedated than having a Democrat an elected official who's a Democrat to actually listen to us. Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna try out that theory. I'm gonna go find an alligator and try to pull out its teeth. Jokes aside, I will say it's really tough to have Democrat elected officials to listen to us, especially like I said, I did have the opportunity to speak to Representative Sean Theory from Houston back in 2023. And she did let us know during the DC conference how difficult it is for Democrats to listen because behind the doors, when it's privately between them, they say, yeah, we know how wrong this is. We should not be doing this. But because of obviously how politics is right now, a lot of them have to say, no, this is great. We need more trans kids. We need to help them not end their lives because obviously suicide rate is high. And that's what they tell the people. That's what they're told by their handlers. That's what these LGBT organizations tell them. And that's what the media is going to push forward. So for them to listen to us is going to be near impossible. Obviously, the best way to make any Democrat listen to us is to make sure you're a constituent of theirs, like myself, who is a constituent of Jasmine Crockett. Bless my heart for that, first of all. But obviously, I have to talk to her and I have to tell her, hey, I'm one of your constituents and I am not fond of what you are doing. I am not happy that you are pushing this ideology. What do I have to do to make you listen to me? And if I have to bring everyone in her district into her office and make her listen and to have everyone say, we as your constituents want you to work with the Republican Party to protect individuals like myself. If we have to do that to every Democrat in office, yeah, most of them are gonna pretend to listen to us, pretend to care. but at least they will know their constituents do not support this. And I think that's what we need, because I believe that it's what Representative Sean Theory had mentioned on why she changed her view on this. I think she mentioned that she had spoken to her own constituent. Many said, no, we don't support this.
It's really hard, uh, especially because the issue has become so publicized and mainstream at this point. And so trans was already a political issue back, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, but it wasn't nearly as public and as mainstream as it is now because of the fight that people are doing with gender ideology. So the bills that are being passed or proposed in across the country, I think there's at least 25 states now. So at least half of the country has some sort of bills trying to prevent minors from transitioning. Um, that's a big deal. That's a lot of people who know about this. It's a lot of publicity. And because of how controversial it is, um, and because of how mainstream it is, I think that Democrats have latched really hard onto this. Democrats and leftists have latched really hard onto this issue because it feels like a human rights issue and it feels like a very human centric issue, which is what the left and the Democrats are usually very concerned with, is like you know, the rights and the freedom of all people to do whatever they want. That's kind of their main thing. And I feel like the trans issue just fits so perfectly into that box for them that they're fighting really hard on this. Um, but like Abel said, I think that going to your representatives and saying, hey, this is my story. I don't agree with this. I know a lot of other people who don't agree with this. Let me bring them into you, or let me show you, their stories, or look into this more on your own time, and you'll see that it's not what you think. Um, but I also think that the internet has become such an echo chamber, and that's where a lot of people spend their time. And I don't think that people in the government are exempt from that. I think that you curate your own online spaces to reflect what you believe, and people are just seeing the same things over and over, which is why a lot of people who are ideologically captured will repeat the same lines over and over, saying the same things, the same statistics that they've heard from other people. And that gets spread everywhere, not just on the internet. That gets spread to government officials, that gets spread to media. Like these statistics that don't really come from anywhere and don't really mean anything. But that's what gets talked about and that's what gets reported on. So I think that the difference between, a Democrat's Instagram feed and the difference between a Republican's Instagram feed can be very, very stark. Um, so I think that's one other big problem right now is kind of, that middle ground is kind of being lost. And there's not a lot of places for us to meet up right now. But I think as time goes on, I think it's going to be easier for Democrats to stand up and say no as this issue becomes even bigger.
Well, the biggest thing was just a shock of actually how big this movement has become, because I remember when Detrans Awareness Day started off 4 years ago as just a webinar. It was just an international webinar hosted by Jen Specht. And only a couple of years later, we're now invited to the White House. We're invited to congressional buildings to speak with legislators and Congress people to try and figure out solutions to prevent this at the federal level. And so I was in awe and so grateful for all the work that we've done at the grassroots level. And on a personal level, it was extremely healing to me because I got to see this was probably the largest gathering of detransitioners and desisters that has ever happened. And so when you get so many wonderful people in the same space that are all on a journey of healing, they're all on a journey of truth, and they're all working towards a higher good to not only heal themselves and their loved ones, but help prevent harm that they've lived through. I mean, it's just a beautiful and inspiring experience. So I'm extremely happy on a personal level that I got a lot of love and healing and give love and healing to my friends but also that the public has been listening to our stories, that we've been successful in getting the media out there and writing and interviews and documentaries that I've been involved with over the years, that now we're in Washington, D.C., Detrans Awareness Day, and the president himself is recognizing the work that we're doing and all the work that needs to happen to prevent this in the future.
You know, part of what's been great about Detrans Awareness Day is that we've all been able to see each other's changes over time as we get further and further away from the time that we were trans, or the time that we were on unnecessary medications, or wearing compression garments we didn't need to be wearing, that made it hard to breathe and more stressful to be alive.
So it's really difficult with the Democrat side of things, because the detransitioners allies right now are mostly, you know, Christian conservative organizations. And so automatically we're seen as the enemy, even though we actually, most of us were Democratic voters all of our lives. Some of us still are. So it's hard when we're forced teamed like that and we're not allowed to even speak our stories into the leftist media. We literally cannot get published. So it's not that we're only trying to ally with a certain ideology, because most of us, as we just spoke to, don't want to be pigeonholed to any ideology, right? After what we've experienced. But it appears that way when someone doesn't really understand the depth of what we're going through. And so I wish that the left would be able to understand that all of us are coming from the left, that we were taught this by the left. This was all part of the leftist infrastructure and universities and our mindsets, you know, this very liberal, open-minded perspective. I mean, we were so open-minded that our brains fell out and we ended up getting our body parts cut off. So I wish they would cut us a little slack. In terms of getting them to awaken, I think it'll be similar to how many of us awakened. We were forced to be humbled by the consequences of our poor decisions and harm that was befallen to us through the medical industry. And so I think for a lot of people on the left, a similar thing might need to happen to them when they realize that the beliefs and the people and the communities that they put their trust into actually betrayed them, and that they were lied to about something. And then, okay, what else am I being lied to about? That's how all of us started to be able to deprogram from the ideology. And I think this is a deeper example of human psychology, where people are very stubborn to change their beliefs until they encounter some kind of cognitive dissonance. And then that dissonance festers long enough where then they say, okay, wait a second, maybe I was wrong about something. So I think for a lot of these people, it might be as simple as they or their child are personally harmed by gender ideology. Like a lot of these parents are just kind of going along as if, you know, we're evil or whatnot, but then their kid comes out as trans. And then they're faced with a dilemma because they're like, well, wait a second, why is my son or daughter, who was just a quirky autistic kid, now wanting to have a mastectomy? Then they start to have cognitive dissonance. So I'm hopeful that we can get enough awareness out there about trauma and about core wounds and the need for interventions. But to be honest, I think it's going to be a long, you know, dragged out process where there is going to be harm that's befallen to these people because of their hubris, that they won't examine it until it hits them where it's close to them.
It's really hard to understand or to imagine them shifting course on this, because it seems like there's a deeper issue involving, you know, kind of just drug pushing, and they're not incorrect that all the fertility drugs, all the birth control drugs, all the trans drugs, it's all kind of more or less one big like pot, and it's a whole market where they're being able to be prescribed to a limitless number of people who actually don't have medical conditions. And so it's just, you have to question why it's core to being a Democrat, to the Democrat identity, when there's people that need access to certain hormones or they will actually die, and those are not necessarily paid for. So it's hard to understand.
Yeah, so a group of detransitioners and parents met with the Secretary of Education Secretary McMahon, and then we met for some officials in the Department of Health and Human Services in the same meeting. And the kind of messaging that we received is this gender issue and preventing harm from occurring is as a top priority in both of these departments. So that would mean getting gender ideology out of K through 12 schools and trying to rework some of the higher ed systems. And I was very happy that Secretary McMahon listened to my story specifically, because I was able to inform her of some new information that the majority of people who transition are actually aged 18 to 25, and they do so in their college years, and that demographic is actually the most vulnerable. And so we can't only just focus on K through 12, but also on higher ed. And she seemed very moved by that. So that was very productive. And then in terms of the HHS department, that was another top priority. And they said that's coming from the top, meaning that President Trump is also highly motivated to stop this harm. And a couple weeks earlier in DC, I had a meeting with one of the director of MAHA, Del Bigtree, who informed me that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is very concerned about what's going on with gender. So I walked away feeling just a relief and a sense of like anti-gaslighting, just a sense of strong reality that the highest departments in the land are very concerned about what's going on, and that they have task force in place right now, or are shortly forming them, to start working on some of our asks, such as they're working on a task force to prepare a systematic review of the evidence for pediatric gender affirmation.
What I'm most concerned about as far as the future of this movement is that because we're having these incredible political gains because of all of the work that those of us who advocate against this ideology have helped to bring about, that people are going to become complacent. Like a lot of people seem to think, oh yeah, if we ban medical transition for young people, then we're going to stop kids from getting harmed. And it's like, well, actually, no, not really. I mean, like I didn't get sucked into the medical pipeline as a child, but even though I trans identified as a child, but I did bind my breasts from a very young age. That's caused permanent damage to my body. We can ban medical transition and kids will still be doing that. It's also really easy for young people to access cross-sex hormones without even needing to see a gender doctor. I was able to do that. I was able to do that in Israel because these hormones are prescribed so freely. They're so ubiquitous at this point that it's hard to even call them a controlled substance. Like if a friend is switching from like testosterone gel to testosterone injections, I mean, that's how I was able to get my hands on some gel. And I didn't need a prescription from a doctor. I didn't even have access to the Israeli healthcare system at that point. So like the fact that this ideology is so rampant, and the fact that it's the ideology that causes the initial harm, and the sort of techno medical industry that further escalates and increases those harms and sort of complexifies them, that's the type of understanding we need to have about this ideology. Like until we take a stance on this ideology, which is like, based on understanding how these harms actually play out, especially when it comes to very young people who are cognitively underdeveloped, we have to understand that the idea that a child can be born in the wrong body, from the moment that idea is adopted, regardless of if or when it's medicalized, that idea in and of itself is the first harm, and it predisposes. And the longer that you actually live a lifestyle based on that lie, every single day that you do that, you're actually harming yourself even more. And you can escalate that harm by medically enshrining it into your body forever. But until we understand that, like, these kids and these young people, they need to be totally de-radicalized from these beliefs, until that becomes like a culture war issue, until things like binding and tucking and social transition become culture war issues, we're going to find ourselves in the same position in just a few years. Because you tell a kid, okay, make whatever decisions you want when you're 18. What they're going to do is just incubate that trans identity for 6 or 7 years until they turn 18, when they're no more capable of consent. They're just going to wake up and now they're going to be angry because you told them no. Like, this was totally my case. You tell these kids, no, you can't transition, you're too young, but you don't actually address the underlying distress that caused them to come to these conclusions about themselves. And like they're actually just telling a kid, okay, do it when you're 18. This is just delaying the harm by a few years. And not, I mean, it's delaying some of the harm by a few years. Of course, these kids will come into gender clinics already with damaged breasts, rib cages, lungs, and genitals because of the binding and tucking, because that'll be the only thing they can do. They'll do exactly what I did. And that will make it even harder for them to reconcile with their bodies. And then you're just delaying the hormonal and the surgical harm of this ideology for a few more years. So it's not actually preventing harm to kids. It's just basically delaying the harm.
I just want to say that I have, like I said, been in the community for over 5 years, but I only started doing activism 4 months ago. I gave my first speech about my detransition in November of 2024. And since then, I have been able to fly across the country, testify on different bills, and meet so many people in the community that I have known for years. And finally, get to give them a hug and say, I know you. And it's so cool to finally meet you. Um, and I'm very grateful that we have a community that, despite our very different backgrounds and our very different experiences, whether it's transitioning with hormones, having surgeries, however far you got, or even, not transitioning at all, but still kind of coming out of that identity. I think it's kind of amazing that we all have this like one thing that we agree on, and it's that we no longer believe that we are the opposite sex, and we accept that. And it's such an amazing feeling to have a community of people who all understand that one thing, even though we're all very different, but we all have this shared common ground.
Obviously, it's always great when we have the opportunity to speak about this conversation on many platforms. Like Elle, I'm one of the old people in this conversation who've been here for a long time. I do hope 2026 it gets better. Obviously, it's always best. Well, let me rephrase that. It needs to get better. Obviously, more people need to listen to us. More people need to give us a voice. But at the same time, I also don't want more people to come out as detrans. And now that's and I have to give a caveat on that, because if I say that, because obviously the more detransitioners that come out means that there are more victims to this ideology, and I don't want more people harmed by it. I actually want less people to be hurt by it. Unfortunately, the reality is that people have been sucked into this, and the transtheology love the more people that come into their group. I don't want more people in the detrans, because that shows the dark reality of this insanity, that more people were hurt. But unfortunately, we do need more of these people who speak out and talk about the harm. But at the same time, I also want them, if they don't need to speak out, they should not. It, obviously, individuals like myself and Elle, we are willing to put our necks out on the line for others, because we know that if no one speaks out for us, nobody will. And I think that's why while I can't speak for Elle, I definitely can speak for myself. That, and that's one of the reasons why I spoke out, because I knew back then there wasn't many men speaking out on this topic, and I knew if no one's going to speak for me, I'll speak for others and myself.
Yeah, I do think that more people are listening to detransitioners and listening to the stories of just the needless medical harm, and asking larger questions, I hope, about the way that the medical system is structured and the concept of mass hysteria.
Absolutely. Detransitioners are being heard more and more. At first it started in the grassroots, private, secretive online discourse, and now it's spread through conservative media, independent media, and we're still holding out for the leftist or liberal side of things to start hearing us. But I mean, we have broken through into the mainstream with these federal executive orders and the Detrans Awareness Day. So I think more and more people are hearing our stories, because we're just not shutting up. We're not going to shut up, because it's not just us that have been harmed. We're now seeing more and more younger and younger kids and young adults coming out. There's lawsuits that are erupting into the media, and this isn't going to go away. In fact, it's just going to escalate. So I feel like our stories are not only being heard, but they're actually, something's actually being done. And as someone who's a survivor of childhood abuse and neglect, for me, it's extremely healing to be able to have actual adults in the room, so to speak, like legislators that actually have real power to make change, not only hearing us and validating that experience as real to combat the gaslighting, but to also do something to actually say, we're not going to allow this to happen anymore. We are going to advocate for things like insurance codes for detransitioners so that they can get medical care. And we are going to try to get gender ideology out of schools so that more kids aren't indoctrinated. So yeah, absolutely. Detransitioners are not only being heard, but they're actually being listened to in a way that is going to create lasting change.
It was very interesting to get yelled at by a former USAID worker, reportedly, just because we were in front of the Heritage Foundation. So that was an interesting moment in my life. It wouldn't have been possible without Detrans Awareness Day.
Detransition is here to stay. The number of detransitioners will only grow. So far, the current administration seems very responsive to them. Elections have consequences. One consequence of the second Trump presidency will likely be a powerful new organizing force on the right, a constituency of detransitioned Americans and their families. Democrats have brought this upon themselves. They were warned. They risked this outcome, and now they seem ready to double down on their risks. The biggest problem that Democrats will face in confronting the new power of detransitioners is that they all have different stories. No single convenient explanation will rationalize them away because the only thing they ever shared was a false belief that their bodies were wrong. They did not come from the right. They did not come from Russia. They did not come from Mars. They were made by an idea, one that is inherently false and harmful. What makes gender ideology dangerous is the story it tells. People who believed that story, who were harmed by it, and rejected that story, are dangerous to the story. The mere existence of detransitioned people creates cognitive dissonance in those who are committed to the ideology of transgenderism. They prove it was never true just by existing.